Hello, everyone. The first part of today's lecture is going to be on sources of information, and then part two will cover ethics. Okay, so first off, sources of information. Here, we're essentially going to be talking about how to be good consumers of information, which is something I've mentioned before. We want to consider sources of information and think critically about how we gain knowledge, where that information comes from, what pitfalls we should be aware of in terms of the credibility of our sources of information. So the four sources of information we'll be talking about are experience, intuition, authority, and research. We'll discuss each and then some pitfalls associated with each one. So first is experience. Experience is really powerful. If we've experienced something or know someone else that has experienced something, it makes it valid and real for us. We trust it because we went through it or we've heard of someone going through it. A source of information can also be considered experience if there's no comparison group. So take this example here. So it says 76% of people who volunteer feel younger than their age. So can we conclude that that volunteering keeps you young? Well, no, not really, because this is an example of experience. There's no comparison group. So this is really just what we call anecdotal. It's based on one group's experience. What about the people who don't volunteer and still feel young? What about the people who are not included in this group of volunteers? And when we're doing research, we need a comparison or control group, a treatment group, and a placebo. Otherwise, it's just considered experience. Let's look at another example. Let's say you notice that you lose weight when you drink a lot of water, and that's your experience. So then can you conclude that drinking water causes weight loss? Well, no, not really, because have you considered other factors? For example, if someone's trying to lose weight, it's likely that they're also doing other things like eating healthy foods, getting exercise, etc. So you can't really isolate one thing as the cause. There are other things that may also contribute to that outcome. So yeah, if you're evaluating research or just even any claim that you hear about, you should ask what else could have led to this result. All right, so intuition. Intuition is also really powerful source of information, but we're gonna look at some ways that our intuition can be faulty and biased. I want to start with some examples to illustrate these pitfalls. So consider this: which is more common, words that begin with the letter R, such as rabbit, or words with R as the third letter, such as abrasive? So the fact is that there are 3 times as many. So here's another example for all you zodiac lovers out there. Consider this horoscope. It says Pisces daily horoscope. The energy of the day is such that you're happier listening to conversations than participating in them. I wish I had some wind chimes to insert in here. So consider this. One pitfall of our intuition is called present bias. That's our tendency to notice when the condition and the outcome are both present. So in this case, this horoscope, the condition is being a Pisces and the outcome is being happier listening. So the present bias, we would especially be attentive to this horoscope if both that condition and the outcome are present. So if you are a Pisces and you are happier listening to conversations today, this is going to resonate and feel very meaningful. You might say, oh my gosh, that's so true. I'm such a Pisces. But you should be critical and think of the other scenarios. If you are not a Pisces, but you are happier listening today, is this zodiac really valid if it's not specific to just Pisces? Or what if you are a Pisces and you're actually happy you participate in conversations today? Is this claim still valid? All right, let's look at another example. Let's say I showed you these 4 cards at the bottom of your screen and I gave you this rule. So the rule is if there's a vowel on one side, then there's an even number on the other side. Which cards would you turn over in order to test the rule? So think about that. So you might have said that you would turn over E and 4, or E or 4, one or the other or both of them. In fact, this was a real research study, and almost 80% of the participants in the original study picked E or 4 or both E and 4 to test the rule. And so that makes sense intuitively based on what the rule is. So, why might this be faulty? Well, if you're only turning over E and 4, then you're only looking to confirm what you think you already know. We call this confirmatory hypothesis testing or confirmation bias. This is when we tend to seek out and accept only the evidence that supports what we already think. But if we want to be good consumers of information, we should also be willing to seek out disconfirming evidence or seek out information that could potentially challenge our original theory or our claim. So that's why in research we need comparison groups. That's why we need placebos. If you remember from lecture 1, a good theory should be falsifiable. We need to be willing to test the opposing hypothesis. And guess what? When you do that, when you do seek disconfirming evidence and it's still in line with your theory, then that only strengthens your original claim. You can be even more confident in your results and in your theory if you turned over all of these cards and they all still fit the rule. So a good consumer of research would turn over all the cards, right? And before we move on, I just want to say here that we're talking about research, but hopefully you're already beginning to see how this applies to the real world and everyday life as well. So another pitfall of intuition is that we are all biased. We all have biases, and some of those can be implicit, meaning that we're not actively aware of them. So biases are mental shortcuts. We tend to focus on the evidence that we like best. We tend to seek again and accept evidence that supports what we, feel intuitively. We are biased in the types of information that we consume. And doing all of these things, it just makes it easier to process things. We tend to think of bias as a bad thing, but everyone has bias, and biases are actually a natural cognitive phenomenon. Our brains cannot possibly process every single aspect of every situation at all times. So based on our experiences in life, we create these mental shortcuts to help us process the world in a very efficient way. But being part of being a good consumer of research and a responsible learner, responsible person, is to be aware of when our biases might stand in the way of us making sound decisions, or when they might impede our ability to be critical thinkers. And then there's something called bias blind spots, which is essentially when we're biased about being biased. That means that we see bias in others, but not in ourselves. Again, no one wants to think of themselves as a biased person because it has such a negative connotation. But not recognizing ourselves as, a biased person just protects us from ourselves and allows us to trust our own faulty reasoning. It's beneficial to recognize that you do have biases and discern when those biases might be getting in the way. The next source of information that we'll discuss is authority. Example of authority could be your famous people, influencers, parents, religious leaders, law enforcement, you name it, even your instructors or your professors. The pitfalls of authorities as a source of information is that we don't often fact check what authority figures say, when in fact they could be biased as well. And the reason we don't do that is often because of some type of power difference or a status difference. So, for example, with kids and their parents, or with an authority figure like law enforcement or a doctor, or status difference, such as when celebrities might be endorsing a product, we might believe that it's so great because of that celebrity status. But authority figures can also have ulterior motives and biases. So it's important to be critical of that. And ways to be critical of authority is to think, how is this person an expert? Where did they get their expertise? How did they get this information? Is this opinion based or is it objective? And also you can be critical about whether or not you can access the primary source data, because a lot of information coming from quote unquote authority figures can be secondhand. So can you get to the source? And always think about, do you have a reason to doubt what is this person's motives? So here's an example of authority gone wrong that you might be familiar with. This is former Dr. Andrew Wakefield. He put out a research article that claimed that vaccines were linked to autism. That article was later retracted. He was discredited, lost lots of respect in the field, lost his stance as a doctor. And because his research was very faulty, the methods were severely flawed, and so he could not have possibly come to that conclusion based on his methods. But before all of that could happen, a lot of people took what he published and ran with it because they figured, well, this information is coming from a doctor, it must be true. You might be familiar with Jenny McCarthy, who kind of championed the anti-vaccination movement nationwide. A lot of people believed her and followed her and still do to this day because she's a celebrity. So she has that status, and people believe her to be, a credible person, when she's not, in fact, at least according to on this topic. So luckily we have Dr. Paul Offit, who is a pediatrician who spoken out extensively against anti-vaccination and has published credible research demonstrating that autism and vaccinations are not correlated. Okay, so here we're at the last source of information we'll discuss is research or empirical information. And so this is more systematic. Empirical means it's based on verifiable information that's verifiable by observation or experience rather than just intuition. So there's different types of sources in this category. There are popular media sources, and then there's scientific-based sources. So first, let's talk about popular psychology. This is the kind of stuff that makes headlines. We have, books, there's magazines, newspaper, wiki pages, popular posts like Huffington Post, and websites like Psychological Science. And so you have to be really critical when you're accessing these types of resources. You have to think about, is this an opinion piece? Wikipedia and things like that aren't heavily regulated. They're often not peer reviewed. They might be checked and people might review them, but they don't go through the same rigorous peer review process that we discussed in lecture 1. So when reading stuff like this, you should always check the sources or the reference list at the end so you can know, is this based on research or is it based on what someone just said? Also, you can consider if they present opposing viewpoints or if it's just one-sided. And then we have our scientific sources. So some examples of these are full-length books, peer-reviewed books, or chapters in books on a specific topic. These are good ways to synthesize knowledge about a topic in a common area. But journal articles are really the bread and butter of psychology research. The goal for most research psychologists is to publish their work in a peer-reviewed journal. Psychologists and students really rely on journal articles primarily for their information and their research. And, just that's where the knowledge base in psychology is. There's 2 main types of articles. There's review articles, which kind of summarize all the knowledge on a topic. They give you a good way to gauge, information that's out there on the variables that you're studying. And then there's empirical articles, which, present a study. And this comprises a lot of what we do and what we use and what we look for in research. So when you're trying to find empirical articles, you got to be careful where you look. Often, it's not going to be the first type of thing that you come across if you're using Google. You most likely need to consult a database like PsycInfo, which you might be familiar with if you're a psychology major. You can access that through the GSU library. There's a big difference if you were to type in, for example, depression, anxiety into PsycInfo than if you type that into Google, if you just Googled it. So there is an alternative for using databases like that. There's Google Scholar. The only issue is that with Google Scholar, you might not always have access to the actual source because you often have to pay for journals. So using GSU, PsycInfo, or the other databases they have can give you access. Okay, so let's talk about reading empirical research or reading journal articles. Reading research is not the same as, you don't read it the same way as you would when you're reading a novel or reading for pleasure or reading something from Google, for example. When you're reading a research article, you should always read with purpose. You should always be focusing on the purpose of figuring out what the argument is and what the evidence is that supports that argument, and then being very critical about what that evidence is. When you're reading journal articles, they all typically follow the same general format, even across disciplines, because we're all using scientific method, right? Some journals might refer to these different components as different words. For example, the discussion might be called the conclusion, or they might not have headings, or the method section might be called present study. But generally, they all have the same types of information, and you can expect all research to be written in a similar way. So I'm just going to go through these different article components. First, you have the abstract. The abstract is a very concise summary. It's usually very limited in terms of the number of words. It's a summary of all parts of the study and the major findings. It's always a good place to start, but don't think that just because you've read the abstract, you know exactly what the study is about. It's just a good way to comb through, like if you're looking for research on a specific topic, you always read the abstract to see if that's what you're actually looking for. Then you have the introduction. The introduction is the background. It gives you the theory and the hypothesis of the study. That's what you're gonna find in the intro. And then you have the method. The method section is going to tell how the study was done in specifics. It should be enough detail that if someone wants to replicate this study, they could do so. So it's going to include the participants, the procedure, the instruments used. So what kind of survey or what kind of testing material did they use to collect data, and all of that. And then you have the results. The results section is just going to be the outcome of whatever tests were done, or whatever analysis was done. So you include relevant tables and figures. So in the results section, you're not explaining the results, you're just reporting the findings. And then you have the discussion section, and this is where you explain the results. This is where you summarize the research questions, synthesize the findings, report how well the data supported or didn't support the theory, what conclusions can you come to, and also, very importantly, it has to discuss the strengths and limitations of the study, the significance of the study, and it may even pose questions for future research, which is my favorite part of reading journal articles. And then lastly, you have the reference section. References your cited sources, and that's usually a good place to look for follow-up information, or if you want to check out, some of the sources that were cited within the article. All right, so that brings us to part 1 of workshop number 2. So go ahead and make sure that you can answer these questions. This is also some good preparation for test number 1. If you plan on submitting this workshop for credit, make sure that you upload your answers to iCollege. And yeah. Also, this is a good time to take a break. If you need one, you can hit pause before we move on to the next topic. All right, so now we'll start our next topic, which is ethics. So this is really important topic, especially considering the history of non-ethical research. Speaking of which, here are some famous examples of unethical research that you might be familiar with. In the PDF slides posted, you'll actually be able to click on each of these for short clips. I'll also link these little clips in the YouTube description box so that you can check those out. Okay. So I'm going to go over these briefly. The first one was Little Albert. So Little Albert was a research experiment done by John B. Watson to demonstrate classical conditioning. He conditioned a little baby to be afraid of soft animals like rats and rabbits by pairing the sight of these animals with loud, scary noises. So you can imagine how that would be quite traumatic for a baby. And then during World War II, Nazis conducted some horrific medical experiments on people who were in concentration camps that led to the creation of the Nuremberg Code, which is the basis for our current code of ethics in psychology. And then some of you might be familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study. that occurred in Tuskegee, Alabama. Researchers were targeting low income African American men to study the progression of syphilis disease. So these men did not provide informed consent to be research subjects. They were told that they were going to be receiving free treatment for bad blood and that they were not allowed to see any other medical professionals. However, they didn't receive any treatment despite the fact that there was a known treatment for syphilis at the time. Researchers just allowed the men to fester and die, to go blind, or to experience other severe health problems associated with syphilis because they wanted to track the progression of the disease rather than actually help these people. All right, next is the Milgram's study. If you're a psychology major, then I'm sure you've heard of this one. It's a study where a participant is told by an authority figure, who was the researcher, to hit a button and shock another person who was in another room when that person made mistakes on a memory test. So this was designed to examine compliance, like how we are obedient to authority figures. No one was actually harmed in this. The person on the other side of the wall was a Confederate or just an actor. But the fact that there was so much deception involved and it caused like a lot of distress for the participants made this unethical. And then the last one, famous unethical experiment was Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. And I know this was unethical, but I have to say it's pretty fascinating to me. This was a social psychology experiment looking at how people behave when they believe that they have power, and then how some people behave when they, don't have power. So they gave some people the role of prisoners and some the roles of officers, and they kind of put them in this real life prison setting and observed them. And the results were really astonishing. They couldn't even finish the experiment because it got so out of control. They've actually turned this into a movie. In the PDF slides or in the link in the description box, you can check out the trailer for the movie. It's pretty fascinating. All right, moving on. So here's just a timeline highlighting some of the events leading up to our current ethical codes. So we had the start of the Tuskegee experiments in the 30s. We had the World War I, which led to the Nuremberg codes and the Milgram studies, which I mentioned. And then there was an Animal Welfare Act to protect animals who were being used in research. And then there's the end of the Tuskegee experiment. So that went on for over 40 years. After all of this, in response to all of these, issues, we get publication of the Belmont Report and the APA Code of Ethics, which we'll talk about now. So the Belmont Report was written by a commission on ethics in response to a lot of the unethical things that were taking place in research. They came up with 3 principles for research done with humans. Those are beneficence, justice, and respect for persons. And then the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, later came up with their code of ethics for research, practice, and teaching in psychology. It includes 5 principles of ethics, and some of those overlap with those from the Belmont Report. So we're going to go through those now. So first up, beneficence and non-maleficence. The goal behind this principle is to maximize the benefit and minimize the harm. So we're talking about benefits to society and then minimizing harm to the participants who are actually participating in the research. So when we're discussing this principle of beneficence, the ethical balance comes into play. When we talk about benefit to society, we're referring to the value of the knowledge that will be potentially gained from this research. In terms of risk to participants, this can be things like, does it cause them discomfort? Is there a financial risk? Is there a risk to their physical and emotional well-being, their sense of safety, things like that? So obviously the best case scenario is if the risk is low but the benefit is high. You should definitely do that study. That's an ideal case. If the risk is high but there's low benefit, you definitely don't want to do that study. It's not worth it if you're not getting anything out of it, but you end up putting people through a lot of hassle. The difficult decisions occur when the risk is high, but there's high benefit, or when there's low risk and low benefit. So If the benefit is really high, but the risk is also high, you have to consider at what cost you're willing to get that benefit, and if there's other ways to meet those needs. If the risk is low, but the benefit is also low, you need to consider, is it even worth it to do this study? The next principle is justice. This principle is rooted in the recognition that fairness and justice entitle all people access to benefit from the contributions of psychology. So, people who the study should benefit should be represented in the study. If I wanted to create an intervention that would be relevant for college student, then that's the population that I want to pull from in my study. All right, next is respect for persons or respect for people's rights and dignity. And under this principle, there's two provisions. One is informed consent. So people should be treated as autonomous agents. They have autonomy. They can do what they want to do. So they should be given the opportunity to provide informed consent. We shouldn't assume that people want to participate in studies or that they will just know what it entails. They should be provided with the opportunity to know what the study is about, who it benefits, what's going to be done with the data, how they're going to be protected, and all of that stuff before they, provide their consent to participate. And then the second provision here is protection for vulnerable populations. So some people have less autonomy just inherently. These are considered vulnerable populations. So some groups that may have less autonomy are children. So children under the age of 18 they cannot consent to a study. They can provide assent, meaning that they have the information, but their parent has to provide consent for them. And then people with disabilities, and also prisoners. So these people in these populations have a lower level of autonomy to, kind of govern themselves. So if you wanted to conduct research with these three vulnerable populations, you would have to be extra careful. And in order to get the study even approved, you really have to demonstrate how you're going to avoid taking advantage of people in these populations. All right, the next one is integrity. So this includes just being accurate, honest, and truthful, and using deception if it's needed to use that responsibly. So here's a helpful summary. You have this in your PDF slides. So this is just, a good visual aid for the 5 ethical principles. Okay, so the APA Code of Ethics also includes 10 standards that cover everything in psychology, from practice like therapy and assessment to teaching and learning in psychology, as well as research. In grad school, I was required to take an ethics class and learn about each of these in great depth. For this class on research methods, the one that's most relevant is going to be Standard 8, that covers research and publication in psychology. Standard 8 is further broken down into 10 parts. So we won't go over all of them, just to cover a few that are relevant. I just want to give you an idea of how research psychologists handle ethics. So a really important one here is the IRB. As psychologists, we can't just go conduct research all willy-nilly. You have to get approval for any study that you do. You get approvals through the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB. The IRB is a diverse body of people that assess the ethics of your study. And by diverse, I just mean that they're from different walks of life. You need to have representation from the scientific community. So you have researchers, you have people who are not researchers, so maybe somebody who's in administration at the institution, someone who is not affiliated with the institution. So this way you have different perspectives on the table. So they convene and then they go over the study and decide to approve it or not approve it. And this is very important in terms of your study. On your consent form, you have to indicate that it was approved by the IRB. You also have to report this when you're writing your study up for publication. All right. Informed consent, I've been mentioning, is very critical in research. This falls under the principle of respect for persons, or respect for people's dignity and rights. People need to know what they're getting into. So Informed consent has a bunch of different components. You have to tell participants the purpose and what the study is going to entail. You need to disclose if there's going to be compensation. So if you participated in a study, you might have gotten course credit or money for participating in research. You need to tell them what if there's any risk or side effects to participating in the study. You need to tell them how you're going to protect their confidentiality. And then freedom to withdraw is a big part. Participants need to have the option to leave the study or stop participating at any point without consequences and for any reason. And then finally, informed consent includes how participants should contact someone if they have questions. So these are things that the IRB would be looking for. Like, did you provide all of these things in your consent form? So there are instances when you do not have to obtain consent, informed consent when you're doing research. And so these are some of those instances. For example, if you are doing research on previously collected data, also known as archival data. So I have an example of this. I've done research evaluation for the Boys and Girls Club of America, and I was conducting analysis on data that they had already previously collected. So I didn't need informed consent for that study. I wasn't collecting the data myself or dealing with any human subjects in that study, and so I didn't have to get informed consent. If you're doing a study just for educational purposes and you're not planning to publish the data anywhere, you also don't need informed consent. For example, if I did an experiment with all of you in this class, or because I wanted to demonstrate something, or if I gave you guys a survey just to demonstrate a concept, but I wasn't doing anything else with the data, I wouldn't need to collect informed consent. And then if it's anonymous means that you are not collecting any identifying information whatsoever. No email addresses, no what state do you live in, like nothing that could potentially identify someone. So if it's completely anonymous, or if you're just observing people in public places, then you don't need consent for those types of studies. All right, deception in research. Deception is used sometimes, but it's very important to be careful about when you use deception. And it's the IRB is very critical. If you say you want to use deception, it's very important that you prove why that is necessary. So when it comes to deception, there's different kinds. There's omission and commission. Omission is withholding details from the study. Commission is actively lying to the participants and telling them something that is not true. And so, depending on the goals of the study, sometimes deception is necessary. So, for example, if you felt like you told them the reason for the study, or if you gave them a piece of information that might undermine the research design, it might defeat the purpose of what you were trying to figure out in that research. And so, sometimes deception is necessary. That brings us to our next issue under the standard, which is debriefing. If you use deception, you must debrief. You have to tell participants that they were deceived and how they were deceived and why they were deceived, why it was necessary. And this is all done in an attempt to just restore an honest relationship between the general public and the scientific community. As you saw in the beginning with those examples, we have a history of being unethical in research, which has led to some mistrust of institutions and people who conduct research. And so this standard is there to mitigate that damage. All right, so there's also standards to protect research on animals. We have something called the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. So this is just like the IRB, but it's for research that's done with animals. So you go through the same process with them. If you have a research study involving animals, you would submit it to them for approval. So when we're considering doing research with animals, there's 3 R's to keep in mind. There's replacement. So, animals are often used as a replacement for human subjects, but you want to make sure that that's a valid replacement. If you can conduct this research not using animals at all, then you should demonstrate that you have attempted to find an alternative. Refinement has to do with minimizing the distress for animals. And then reduction refers to using as few animals as possible in the study. And then the last standard that I'm going to address has to do with publication. So we definitely have to be very careful and ethical when reporting research, because other researchers as well as the general public rely on these publications for the knowledge base. This is the authority, right? So they use information to make decisions, to inform our practice, inform therapy. So the research publications have very real implications for people's lives. And so maintaining ethical standards when reporting research results is key. Two things I'll bring up here are data fabrication and data falsification, and talk about what the difference is between the two. So data fabrication is when you invent data, you fabricate, you come up with data to fit the hypothesis or the theory. So you're just making stuff up. Whereas data falsification is when you're intentionally influencing the results of a study by doing a number of things. You might delete observations, or throughout the course of the actual study, you're encouraging participants to act in a way that aligns with the theory or respond in a way that aligns with the theory. So you might be giving subtle hints or not so subtle hints for people to do things that you expect or that are in line with your theory, instead of just collecting data in an honest way. Okay, so that brings us to the second part of workshop 2. Be sure to answer these questions. Even if you're not planning to submit workshop 2, this is good practice for the exam, just to check and make sure you understand the information as well. All right, that's all, folks. Until next time.